Emily Carter was just 17 when she vanished after a summer fair 25 years later. Her brother Ryan Carter was revealed as her killer through DNA she left behind while fighting for her life. The perfect family, the unsolvable murder, and the shocking betrayal hidden in plain sight. This is the story of how science finally uncovered the truth. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, something changed forever. One hot summer evening in 1999, Emily Carter, a sweet and promising 17-year-old, disappeared without a trace. That night, the air was thick and still, as if the world itself paused. Emily had gone to the annual county fair, a celebration of bright lights, laughter, familiar faces, and favorite rides. She'd asked her parents if she could go with friends, and they agreed, trusting her completely. Everyone loved Emily. She was kind and smart, always ready to lend a hand. She was the kind of daughter any parent would be proud of, top of her class, captain of the debate team, and the kind of friend who remembered birthdays and called just to say hello. As the sun dipped below the trees that night, Emily and her friends Sarah and Mike walked the fairgrounds, trying games, sharing cotton candy, and laughing as the Ferris wheel carried them high into the sky. Somewhere between the ring toss and the music booth announcing prize winners, Emily said she would go get water and meet them back near the big oak tree at the entrance. They watched her walk away, her ponytail bobbing, and figured she'd be back in a minute, but she never returned. Sarah and Mike waited, first for 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. They started to worry. They walked toward the food stands, then behind the Ferris wheel. They asked vendors if they'd seen Emily heading to the entrance. No one remembered. They checked near the water fountain and asked families just leaving the fair if they'd seen her. Fear began to twist in their stomachs. Emily had simply disappeared. Sarah called her mom, voice shaking as she relayed what was happening. Authorities arrived, local police, and a few fair staff. The initial belief was that Emily had been separated from her friends in the crowd. The amusement park was wide, the fair stretching across acres of grassy field and paths between vendor booths. It was easy to lose sight of someone. But even as officers swept through the area with flashlights, called on megaphones, and posted descriptions, there was no sign of Emily. 2 days later, a group of hikers discovered her body in a nearby patch of woods, a place of thick underbrush just beyond the town's limits. The search team was already out, combing through woods and fields, following any clue they could find. But finding her body brought a new kind of heartbreak to Willow Creek, the idyllic community, where people waved at neighbors and children rode bikes freely down the streets, suddenly felt unsafe and uncertain. The coroner reported blunt force trauma to the head as the cause of death. Emily's hands had been clenched. It seemed she had struggled. There were no obvious signs of a sexual assault, which brought a small relief in the horror. The weapon was missing. There was no trace of it. Investigators found tiny flecks of blood splattered on branches and leaves near the scene, but no fingerprints. Her clothing had no tears or cuts, and no clue rested on her clothes. It was as though whoever did this had wiped away everything. Officers learned Emily had walked through those woods before. She sometimes took shortcuts home when she stayed late studying or working at the volunteer station in town. But this night she hadn't made it. The scene looked carefully cleaned. Some bloodstains remained, but most had been concealed or wiped away. Authorities realized the killer had known the woods and known how to hide evidence. The Carter family stood by the scene, grief-stricken and confused. Emily's father, Tom, pressed himself to stay calm, but his face broke when he saw the blood-spattered branches. Her mother, Claire, wrapped her arms around Tom, leaning into his strength. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. Emily was gone. They watched as investigators bagged evidence, their hands covered in gloves, eyes scanning every inch of ground. In the days that followed, detectives interviewed more than 50 people, friends, teachers, classmates, fair employees. They went door to door, knocking on every home in the neighborhood. They asked house cleaners, mail carriers, dog walkers, anyone who might have seen someone strange in the area. They looked at Emily's phone records, traced her final calls, and asked about any possible conflicts or grudges she may have had. But no one voiced anything more than normal teenage ups and downs. High school hallways buzzed with whispers. Was Emily involved with someone older? Did she have a secret boyfriend? Rumors swirled, but interviews revealed nothing. She'd been focused on college applications, planning to study environmental science. She volunteered with younger kids during after-school programs and had been saving up for a summer trip abroad. She had no known enemies, no fights reported, and no sign she'd made someone angry enough to kill. Forensic experts dusted her favorite sweater and the stone bridge she crossed on her way home when it got dark. They found a few fibers and microscopic hair samples, more than typical, but nothing that yielded a match. A stray hair on her jacket was tested. No match. Blood traces didn't trace to any suspect. Investigators took soil samples from the woods, footprints, debris. Nothing flagged a suspect. Even a cadaver dog was brought in, but it signaled around the same spot. The scent ended there. The killer had cleaned, covering any trail. Emily's family watched every television update. The town shared posters offering a reward. Everyone prayed. But as weeks passed into months, the file began to gather dust. Detectives who once staffed the case moved on or retired. The new officers who came in looked at the old notes, read the faded reports, and sighed. They saw no path forward. With a missing weapon, wiped scene, no eyewitnesses, and no suspect, the case slowed to a standstill. Claire refused to give up. 6 months after Emily's death, she held a bench dedication at the edge of town, an engraved plaque reading, "In loving memory of Emily Carter. Forever in our hearts." She stood there, watching children play. She imagined Emily sitting on that bench, reading a book, happy and at peace. She believed the killer would make a mistake, that truth and justice would one day come. Ryan, Emily's older brother, had been in college when she died. He had rushed home when he heard the news. He was distraught, visibly shaken. He moved into separate housing and returned to studies after the funeral. His answers always matched his friends' statements. He'd been at a bar with classmates during the time of Emily's disappearance. He had receipts, witnesses, photos. On paper, Ryan was innocent. Still, on the night of the funeral, Ryan stood at the graveside, distant. Claire noticed how his body seemed to sag. His eyes looked hollow. But the town whispered about his calm tone, his lack of tears, the hands shoved deep into Zhang pockets. But suspicion was not enough. His alibi held. His innocence was unbroken until it didn't matter anymore. For 25 years, Willow Creek lived with echoes. Every year on the anniversary of her death, Claire left wildflowers at the cedar grave, praying for a solution that never came. The case stayed unsolved, a haunting reminder of danger hidden in peaceful places. The woods near town grew greener with every season, but the memory of that tragic summer stayed white and cold in the hearts of many. The chapter closes with the case locked away unchanged, unanswered. The pain remained. The mystery kept Willow Creek restless. No one could forget Emily. The town waited for a miracle, for someone to speak, for forensics to evolve. All they had was hope. After Emily's death, the Carter family was never the same. Their once cozy home on Maple Lane became a silent house full of shadows. The cheerful sounds of Sunday breakfasts and late-night movie marathons were replaced with quiet, sobs behind closed doors and a thick tension that never lifted. Her parents, Tom and Claire, tried to hold on for the sake of appearances, but the grief clawed at them from different directions. Tom buried himself in work, staying late at the office, avoiding the rooms that reminded him of Emily. Claire wandered through the house like a ghost, touching picture frames, folding Emily's clothes, and lighting candles that never seemed to burn long enough to comfort her aching heart. Ryan, Emily's older brother, left a week after the funeral. He had just come home for the summer from college, and while he stayed long enough to help with the arrangements, he grew distant quickly. Friends who had known the Carter family for years noticed the change. Ryan, once outgoing and protective of his little sister, seemed hollow. He didn't speak much at the memorial, and when he did, his voice trembled, not with sorrow, but with something else people couldn't quite name. He hugged his parents stiffly and left town without saying goodbye to many of the people who came to pay their respects. Back at college, Ryan kept his distance from friends. He skipped classes, avoided social gatherings, and missed exams. Professors noted his declining performance. He told some people that he was struggling with the trauma of his sister's murder, and no one questioned it. Everyone understood that kind of loss could change a person. But what struck some was his lack of emotion when asked about Emily. He would nod, say it was tragic, then quickly change the subject. Some of his roommates found it unsettling. Back in Willow Creek, rumors began to spread. They were quiet at first, whispered behind closed doors, exchanged in hushed voices in the grocery store or after Sunday service. Neighbors recalled how Ryan had been acting in the weeks before Emily's death. Some said they'd seen him pacing the backyard late at night. Others remembered hearing raised voices in the Carter house just days before the murder. It was nothing concrete, just fragments of observation and suspicion, but they lingered in people's minds. One afternoon, nearly a year after the murder, Claire found a journal in Emily's bedroom. It was tucked behind her bookshelf, hidden among old notebooks. Most of the entries were typical teenage reflections, school stress, friendships, future plans. But the last few pages were different. They were vague, but hinted at a growing fear. Emily had written about someone close to her making her uncomfortable, someone she no longer trusted. She never named the person. She didn't accuse anyone. But her words spoke of unease, of secrets, and of being watched. Claire brought the journal to the police, hoping it could reignite interest in the case. Investigators reviewed it, but without a name or direct accusation, there was little they could do. Tom dismissed the journal as the emotional outpouring of a stressed teenager. He said Emily had been under pressure with college applications and had always been dramatic in her writing. But Claire wasn't convinced. She knew her daughter's patterns, and the tone in those entries was different. Emily had been scared. Claire began to wonder if someone close to them, someone they had trusted, had been hiding something all along. Despite the whispers, nothing ever formally implicated Ryan. His alibi remained intact. He had been at a bar that night with friends, all of whom confirmed his presence. Surveillance footage, though grainy, showed someone resembling him inside the bar at the right time. Receipts showed he paid for drinks. No physical evidence linked him to the crime. The police had no grounds to accuse him, and eventually the trail went cold. Claire and Tom began to grow apart. Tom refused to discuss the case anymore. He had accepted that they might never get answers and preferred not to dwell on the pain. Claire couldn't let go. She spent hours each week rereading the old case files she had begged the police to share. She created timelines, studied maps, and even consulted with amateur online sleuths. Her obsession with solving the case created distance between her and Tom, who believed they needed to move on. Eventually, the weight of grief and disagreement fractured their marriage. They divorced quietly, without public drama. Tom moved to a different city, taking a new job and starting over. Claire stayed in Willow Creek, unwilling to leave the only place that still felt connected to her daughter. Over the years, Emily's case became a local legend. It was mentioned in true crime blogs, discussed in online forums, and even featured in a small-town documentary. Each time, the story ended the same way: an unsolved mystery, a grieving family, a beautiful girl lost too soon. With time, interest faded. New crimes took over the headlines, and Emily's story became part of the town's past. But Claire never gave up. She continued to visit the police station once a year, asking if there were any updates. She stayed in contact with detectives who had retired and kept a box filled with every newspaper clipping, every theory, every detail. She even submitted the old evidence to private labs, hoping that advances in DNA testing might reveal something the original investigators had missed. Ryan, meanwhile, built a life of his own. He married, had children, and moved several states away. On the surface, he seemed to have left the tragedy behind. He rarely spoke of Emily, and when he did, it was brief and impersonal. Those who knew him during that time described him as private, sometimes moody, but not violent. Still, some who had known the Carter family well never felt comfortable around him again. Something about the way he detached from the loss of his sister felt unnatural. Even 25 years later, some of Emily's high school friends still thought about her. At reunions, her name would come up, followed by long silences and sad glances. They remembered her as bright and full of life, a girl who deserved more. Some admitted they'd always wondered about Ryan, but felt guilty for thinking it. Others said they had let the past go, but Claire never did. She believed someone knew the truth. She believed the answer was close, maybe even within the family. and she believed that science, time, or fate would eventually bring justice. Every year on Emily's birthday, she left a letter on the cemetery bench. In each one, she wrote that she loved her daughter and promised she would never stop searching. The town might have moved on, the police might have given up, but a mother's determination, grounded in love and haunted by suspicion, would not fade. And one day, the truth would come home. In 2024, a newly formed cold case task force began reviewing old files across the state, focusing on unsolved murders with preserved biological evidence. Emily Carter's case stood out immediately. The brutal killing of a teenage girl with no suspects and no closure had left a permanent mark on Willow Creek. The detectives assigned to re-examine the case were part of a specialized unit trained in advanced forensic techniques that had existed in 1999. Among their tools was the use of modern DNA extraction and genealogical mapping, a method that had solved dozens of cases nationwide in recent years. The old evidence was carefully transported from storage-sealed bags labeled with dates and item numbers, fragile files with faded ink, and the clothes Emily had worn the night of the fair. The key focus was the scrapings collected from beneath her fingernails. Back in 1999, the material had yielded partial and inconclusive results. But technology had come a long way. Now, even degraded genetic material could be amplified and decoded with precision. The forensic lab assigned to the case began the meticulous process of reanalyzing the sample. Using enhanced touch DNA analysis and modern sequencing, they managed to extract a complete DNA profile from the skin cells under Emily's nails. The result was unexpected. The profile was male, closely related to Emily, and it did not match any samples in the National Criminal Database. With this discovery, investigators turned to genealogical DNA tools. Instead of relying on matches in the criminal system, they submitted the profile to public ancestry databases, platforms that allowed law enforcement access in cases involving violent crimes. Within weeks, the team received a promising match, a distant cousin from a branch of the Carter family tree. From there, they began constructing a family network, working backward from the relative and filling in the gaps using public records, obituaries, and online trees. Slowly, the web narrowed. As names were added and connections mapped, the investigators focused on immediate family. Only one person in the close family circle matched the profile's characteristics with such precision. The DNA belonged to Ryan Carter, Emily's older brother. This discovery sent shockwaves through the task force. Ryan had never been officially a suspect. He had always maintained an alibi and was known to have been out with friends the night Emily disappeared. But the DNA was indisputable. It wasn't just a vague association, it was a direct match. Ryan's genetic material had been found under Emily's fingernails, indicating a violent struggle between the two. It was the first real lead in 25 years, and it came from a source that could not lie, forget, or be misinterpreted. Detectives reviewed everything again, this time with new eyes. They pulled old interviews, rewatched the funeral footage, and re-examined Ryan's behavior during the original investigation. They noted how detached he had been. They re-interviewed old friends who mentioned how strangely he had acted in the weeks following Emily's death, moving away quickly, avoiding the topic of his sister, and becoming emotionally withdrawn. Investigators then began to look at Ryan's life post-1999. He had moved to another state, gotten married, started a successful career, and had 2 children. On the surface, he lived a quiet, unremarkable life. But something about the way he had removed himself entirely from his past felt deliberate. There were no memorial posts on social media, no mention of his sister in family gatherings, and no signs that he had stayed close to his parents after the divorce. Ryan had done what he could to vanish from the emotional remnants of his former life. A subpoena was obtained for a sample of Ryan's DNA to confirm the match. He had no idea the walls were closing in. Law enforcement visited his home, posing as part of a health department survey and collecting a discarded item that contained his DNA. The result was conclusive. The DNA found under Emily's fingernails was his. The probability of the match being anyone else was less than 1 in a billion. There was no ambiguity left. When the arrest warrant was signed, officers traveled across state lines. Ryan was taken into custody without incident. At first, he claimed he had no idea what the accusation was about. He remained calm, even as the charges were read aloud. But when confronted with the DNA evidence, his expression reportedly shifted. He asked for an attorney and refused to answer further questions. Back in Willow Creek, the news spread quickly. People who had known the Carters were stunned. Many had long ago put the mystery behind them. Some still remembered the early whispers about Ryan, the ones that had felt too cruel to believe. Now, they realized those quiet suspicions had not been far from the truth. The idea that the killer had not only been part of Emily S.'s life but also her own blood was almost too much to process. The authorities now focused on building a solid case for trial. Motive became the next priority. While DNA proved Ryan had been at the scene and involved in a violent struggle with Emily, it did not explain why. Investigators combed through old-school records, counseling logs, and journals. One entry in Emily's hidden notebook stood out, an undated passage that mentioned a secret she had discovered. It hinted that someone close to her had betrayed her in a deep and frightening way, and she wasn't sure how to confront them. Digital forensics experts recovered fragments of deleted emails and files from Ryan's old college laptop, stored in a long-forgotten hard drive archived at the university. Among them was a disturbing draft of a letter to Emily. The message was never sent but revealed a tone of frustration and panic. It alluded to a fight between them, to things Emily had threatened to reveal. The contents were vague but dark enough to add weight to the growing theory that the murder had been personal, driven by fear and desperation rather than a random act of violence. The prosecution began to build the narrative. Ryan had returned home that summer in crisis. He was failing classes, losing control of his future, and possibly engaging in activities that would have brought shame or legal trouble. Emily, being close to him, likely found out something damning. Whether it was a financial scam, inappropriate relationship, or abuse, whatever it was, Emily had planned to tell their parents. The theory went that on the night of the affair, he followed her, confronted her, and things escalated beyond his control. The moment Ryan's DNA was identified, the case turned from a mystery into a courtroom-bound reality. It had taken 25 years, but the truth had emerged from the smallest trace of skin, preserved through time and silence. No one could have guessed that the answer had been hidden in plain sight, sitting quietly at family dinners, posing for pictures, attending memorials, all while carrying the weight of a dark secret. For investigators, it was a powerful reminder of how science had changed the landscape of justice. What once required confessions, witnesses, or physical evidence now could be solved by a microscopic clue. And for Claire Carter, it was the beginning of long-awaited answers, proof that her daughter's final act, scratching and fighting, had left behind the key to the truth. After the arrest, Ryan Carter's name was plastered across local and national headlines. News anchors repeated the same chilling phrase over and over. The killer had been in the family all along. The shock reverberated beyond Willow Creek. People who had never known Emily or her family were captivated by the cruel twist. Online forums lit up with amateur sleuths analyzing every available detail, dissecting Ryan's body language in old interviews, and theorizing about what truly happened that night 25 years ago. But in Willow Creek, the story felt far more personal. It wasn't just a mystery solved. It was a rupture through the heart of the community. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors worked closely with the cold case unit to establish a clear motive. They already had the most compelling evidence possible, DNA from under Emily's fingernails. It was irrefutable, but the legal team wanted more. They wanted to explain not just how, but why this horrific act had happened. They combed through decades of records, personal accounts, and pieces of the Carter family's private history that had never seen the light of day. One of the most telling discoveries came from a family friend who had worked as a youth counselor during that summer in 1999. She remembered that Emily had been anxious in the weeks before her death. Not outwardly fearful, but distracted. She had pulled the counselor aside one afternoon and asked a vague question about protecting someone from being hurt by a family member. The counselor had assumed it was hypothetical, just a curious teenager exploring serious subjects. Now, that memory carried a sinister weight. Another lead came from a series of therapy notes written by a counselor Ryan had seen while in college. Obtained through a court order, the notes revealed a history of unresolved anger and feelings of resentment toward his family. He felt overshadowed by Emily's achievements and burdened by expectations he believed he could never meet. There were mentions of jealousy, fear of being exposed for something he had done, and deep frustration about losing control of his life. The therapy sessions stopped abruptly weeks after Emily's murder. Investigators theorized that Emily had discovered something about Ryan, something serious enough to make her confront him or threaten to tell their parents. It may have involved behavior he knew would bring disgrace or legal trouble. The specifics remained unclear, but the emotional picture was becoming sharper. Ryan, cornered and desperate, may have followed her the night of the fair. He could have waited in the woods near the shortcut she usually took. He would have known her route, her habits, and how to avoid being seen. The confrontation was likely short. Emily had fought back. The DNA under her nails proved that. But Ryan was stronger and filled with panic. The blow to her head was likely delivered with a large stone or piece of wood, something from the forest floor. The weapon was never found, but forensic experts determined the wound pattern aligned with common objects found in that wooded area. After the act, he had carefully removed any obvious evidence. He wiped away prints, removed her phone, and dragged her deeper into the trees. His calm demeanor in the days that followed now seemed like calculated detachment. The legal team began constructing a timeline and theory of the crime for trial. Meanwhile, Claire Carter sat quietly through every pretrial hearing. Her face, hardened by grief and years of unanswered questions, betrayed no emotion as she watched her only surviving child led into court in handcuffs. Reporters begged her for comments, but she remained silent. Those who had known her over the years said the discovery had broken something in her that would never be repaired. Losing Emily had been unbearable. Learning that Ryan was responsible was something even worse, something beyond grief, something unspeakable. The community's reaction was mixed. Some residents expressed shock and horror. Others admitted they had always wondered about Ryan. Former classmates recalled subtle red flags, angry outbursts, strange comments, or sudden mood swings. A few people who had known Ryan in college even reached out to authorities with stories of troubling behavior, none of which had ever seemed serious enough at the time to report. Now, every memory was reevaluated through the lens of what he had done. Media coverage intensified as the trial date approached. Legal analysts debated whether Ryan would take a plea deal or risk a trial by jury. The evidence was overwhelming, but the defense suggested a possible strategy, arguing that the killing had been accidental, the result of a sudden argument rather than premeditation. They claimed Ryan had no criminal history and no signs of violence before or after the crime. But the prosecution countered with the brutal nature of the act, the careful cover-up, and Ryan's 25 years of silence. In a surprising move, Ryan changed his plea before the trial began. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In court, he stood before the judge and admitted that he had caused Emily's death. He did not explain his motive. He did not apologize. He merely stated that he accepted responsibility and was prepared to face the consequences. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was delivered. 25 years in prison, the same number of years Emily had been gone. There was no applause, no sense of victory. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow. The truth had arrived too late to save anyone. Claire Carter left the courthouse without speaking to her son, her former husband, or the press. She walked alone, clutching a small photograph of Emily taken at the county fair that summer, the last picture ever taken of her daughter alive. In the weeks following the sentencing, the story began to fade from the news cycle. Another case would take its place, another mystery, another headline. But for Willow Creek, the resolution of Emily's murder left a permanent mark. People began to look differently at the familiar faces around them. They remembered how easily someone could hide a terrible secret behind a polite smile or a grieving expression. Claire eventually moved away from Willow Creek. She donated Emily's belongings to a local women's shelter and left the bench by the cemetery, now weathered and cracked, as a quiet memorial. She left behind the house on Maple Lane, the place that had once been filled with laughter and music, and then silence and sorrow. The new owners planted a tree in the front yard, a weeping willow that would grow tall over the years. Though Ryan would spend the rest of his life behind bars, no one truly felt that balance had been restored. Emily's life had been full of promise and light, stolen by someone who was supposed to protect her. The irony was unbearable. But the case became a lesson about the persistence of truth, the evolution of forensic science, and the reality that sometimes the greatest dangers live under the same roof as the people we trust most. The case of Emily Carter was closed, but the scars remained, invisible and deep. And while the world turned its attention elsewhere, one truth lingered in the minds of all who knew the story. Justice may be delayed, but it cannot be erased. After the sentencing, the quiet returned to Willow Creek, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet that had existed before Emily Carter's murder. This time, it was heavier, final. The townspeople still walked their dogs along the sidewalks and picked up groceries from the same corner store, but there was a shadow in the air. An invisible weight that came from knowing the monster had never been outside, it had been within. The final chapter of Emily's story had been written, but for many, it only raised deeper, more difficult questions about trust, family, and what it means to live with a truth that cannot be undone. Ryan Carter was transferred to a maximum security prison, where he would serve out his 25-year sentence. He would be in his early 70s when he became eligible for parole, assuming he lived that long. He didn't speak to the press, and he never gave a statement to explain his actions. There were no interviews, no attempts to justify or apologize. He simply disappeared into the prison system, just as he had emotionally disappeared from the family after the murder. Silence had defined him from the beginning, and it remained his only consistency. The aftermath of the case rippled far beyond the courtroom. Claire Carter, now a woman who had buried both her children, one in a grave and one in a prison cell, became a symbol of quiet resilience. She sold the house on Maple Lane, unable to spend another season walking past Emily's old bedroom. She relocated to a small coastal town 2 states away, where no one knew her name and no one asked about the past. There she lived a quieter life, volunteering occasionally at a local animal shelter and spending long hours walking by the ocean. She kept a single-frame photograph of Emily on her mantel, and every year on her daughter's birthday, she lit a candle and let it burn until it flickered out. The town, too, began its slow process of healing. The bench in the park, once just a memorial, became a place of reflection. Teenagers would sit there and whisper about the murder, not with the morbid curiosity they once had, but with a kind of reverence. Teachers at the high school spoke about Emily with careful words, and her story was sometimes used in lessons about forensic science and ethics in criminal justice. She became more than a victim. She became a name that mattered, a reminder that truth cannot always stay buried. The cold case unit that had cracked Emily's case received commendations, and their work inspired other departments to reopen long-forgotten files. Across the state, similar breakthroughs began to emerge as advancements in forensic genealogy gave new life to evidence once considered useless. Emily's story became part of a larger movement, proof that time and technology could unite to solve even the most stubborn of mysteries. Her name was mentioned in conferences and seminars. Law enforcement officials described her case as a turning point, an example of why nothing should be left behind. But even as the system celebrated its success, the emotional cost remained steep. Friends of the Carter family, who had stood by Claire during the early days of grief, now struggled with guilt. They had supported Ryan at the funeral. They had offered him condolences. Some had hugged him, reassured him, told him they were sorry for his loss. That realization was hard to live with. For some, it felt like betrayal. For others, it was a painful reminder of how easily evil can wear a mask. The most haunting element of the case was not just that Emily's killer had been her brother, but that he had lived so long in freedom. For 25 years, he had built a life, raised children, celebrated birthdays, and tucked his past away so deep that even those closest to him never suspected a thing. His ability to compartmentalize was chilling. The court-appointed psychiatrist who evaluated Ryan before sentencing described him as emotionally detached and possibly narcissistic. Someone who viewed the crime as a mistake that had to be managed rather than a life-shattering tragedy. He hadn't been haunted by what he had done, he had simply moved forward, rewriting the narrative of his life while leaving Claire to carry the burden of unanswered questions. The district attorney who prosecuted the case later spoke at a community event, describing how crucial the advancement in DNA and genealogical mapping had been. He explained that without the preserved evidence and the dedication of Claire Carter to keep the case alive, Emily's story might have ended as a cold case file in a dusty drawer. He praised the determination of investigators who refused to let the trail grow cold. He did not speak Ryan's name. Instead, he focused on the victim, making it clear that justice belonged to Emily. Over time, interest in the case naturally declined. The headlines faded and new tragedies took the stage. But for those closest to it, the memory never dulled. Some of Emily's high school friends still gathered every few years to share stories and visit her grave. They placed flowers on the bench, wrote messages on slips of paper, and left them tucked beneath the plaque. Some notes were filled with sorrow, others with gratitude for the memories, for the closure, for the reminder that time doesn't always erase but sometimes reveals. Emily's story became more than a crime. It became a lesson in patience, perseverance, and the hidden dangers that sometimes live behind the safest of doors. Her name was etched into the history of Willow Creek, not just for how she died, but for what her case uncovered. It reminded people that appearances can be deceiving, that silence can be dangerous, and that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way. In the final analysis, there were no winners. A young girl lost her life, a family was destroyed from the inside, and justice, though served, came too late to spare anyone from the pain. But there was one undeniable victory. The truth had been spoken. The questions that haunted a mother, that haunted a town, had finally been answered. And so, the story closed not with triumph, but with clarity. The mystery that had once baffled detectives and torn a family apart was no longer unsolved. Emily Carter's voice, silent for decades, had spoken at last through the microscopic fragments of a struggle, through the science that refused to forget, and through the courage of those who never stopped listening.